From RFN Studios, this is Radio Free Norfolk. As part of our Remembrance Day episode, we spoke with long-term military member Captain Peter Davis about his career and our local 6'9" Fielld Battery.
Our guest today is Captain Peter Davis, who's a local boy from Simcoe, born and raised, I believe.
Yes, I was.
First of all, why don't you tell our listeners your background about in the military?
I'm a Simcoe, Norfolk boy, Simcoe born and raised. I joined the 6'9" Fielld Battery, which is the Army Reserve Unit here in Simcoe in 1978. I spent 10 years in the Army Reserve with this unit, and I then transferred to the regular force, the full-time active forces in 1988, and remained there until 2016. Doing a whole bunch of different jobs over the years. We can talk about that. And then I transferred back to the reserve force, and my wife and I were lucky enough to be able to move back home, and I'm finishing now as a reserve officer at my first unit that I joined as a kid. So for me, the circle has gone full. I'm right back where I started, and happy to be doing it. Despite my best efforts, I've reached a very unique club of those that get what we call the CD3, the Canada Decoration 3, where you achieve over 42 years of service. There's not a lot of people that achieve that. So I'm pretty proud of that, and I'm happy to keep serving as long as I can.
For Peter, his family roots are deeply connected to the Canadian Armed Forces.
My grandfather Mills served as a sapper in the First World War. What we've been able to collect from his time in the war, which is difficult for some of the First War veterans due to the nature of the battles. But my grandfather Mills served in a number of battles, including Vimy Ridge. He managed to survive the war, came home and raised a family. And my other grandfather, Percy Davis, my father's dad, was a pilot officer in the Royal Flying Corps, who flew with camels during the latter part of the First War. Dad was an Army reservist here. He's well known in the community. Passed away a number of years ago, but Dad was a captain in the Army Reserve Unit here. And my brother Chris, of course, served close to 40 years with the reserves here in Simcoe and with 56 Field Regiment. So yeah, I guess you could see we were connected militarily.
And your brother was a sergeant, right, when he retired?
He retired as a sergeant, yes.
Peter told us about the evolution of his career and the military over the years, but also what has stayed the same.
Oh, I've done a variety of things over the years. I've been fortunate enough to have the confidence of my commanders and the Government of Canada to serve in a variety of places. When I was in the regular force, I served overseas on a number of exercises. A lot of listeners will know with North Atlantic Treaty Organization, Canadian contribution to NATO. Norway, Germany on exercises. A lot of the Cold War guys will remember those days. Later on into the early 90s, I served in Cyprus as an officer with the Canadian contingent to the United Nations tour in Cyprus. Then, of course, we switched kind of, I guess the focus of the Canadian Army, at least, switched into the Balkans later in the 90s. And I've had the opportunity to serve in former Yugoslavia and Bosnia as an artillery officer with the stabilization force there. Flash forward into the 2000s, and I've been over to Afghanistan several times as an artillery officer working with stabilization force there. Canadian Army, I've over 42 years, I've seen tremendous change within the Canadian Armed Forces. But one thing always holds true, and I'm not trying to make a statement, but it's 42 years of seeing some of the best Canada has to offer. There's nothing more noble than to serve your country. And it's been great to work with young men and women, and not so young men and women, over the last 42 years. Proud Canadians from across Canada, different demographics, to get together toward a common cause, both here in Canada and overseas. Today's Army is really no different. We have young Canadians, very well educated, far more educated than we were when we joined, doing much the same thing, but they all have one common thread from when I joined, and I'm sure that from when our predecessors joined, that they all have one common goal. They want to serve Canada. Couldn't ask for a more noble gesture than that.
Peter reflects on his time and Canada's time in Afghanistan.
How many tours did you do in Afghanistan?
First went there in 2003, shortly after we started going there. I wasn't there for the initial tours, the Op Apollo missions, but we got into the Op Athena missions. I was there in 2003 for a 6-month tour. I went back again in 2008, 2009 to Kandahar. I should mention the first tour was in Kabul at the national capital. Then the Canadian footprint moved down south to Kandahar, as many know, and I did my second tour there. I went back over again a couple of years later for a short, what we call in the military, technical assistance visit. It was only about a couple of months working with the headquarters in Kandahar. So you can say, I guess, 3 times over the years. But my wife will tell you it seemed a lot longer than that.
Do you think that the Canadians made a real impact?
That's a good question. I mean, that really is a good question. We all like to hope we did. But that's really not for us to say how do we gauge a success. I do know that, we had every time we saw little kids walking around, going to school, things like that, it was like, to us, it was normal. And a lot of the Canadian troops that I worked with, of course, were family people, husbands, wives, they were parents. And of course, they can identify with kids going to school. And I think that it made us happy to see that people were going to school, which is I know for a lot of kids in Canada, I think they take school for granted. Where in countries like that, being able to go to school and safely get home is a big deal. So it was good, encouraging to see that, to see local population kind of get back on the ground and back to whatever they call normal. I don't know, at the end of the day, I really can't say for sure if we made a difference, but we like to hope we did. The Canadians that I worked with, and I know that a lot of our allies always regarded the Canadian service personnel as very, they were unpartisan. They worked, they tried their very best to help people, and they also tried to maintain the peace with our allies. So working very closely with other nations, of course, in a multinational force. I like to think, again, that we were well regarded amongst our allies as well, as doing a good job over there. Like, we're just serving soldiers. We're ordered by our government to go help when we go. It really, a lasting effect. I know the people of Afghanistan have their culture is their own. We tried to be very mindful of, and I know we really were, is to get to know their culture and understand how they think. To them, what's normal? This is a culture is very proud. Very proud. I think a lot of colleagues of mine would agree, where they certainly respect their elders. They generally think in long term. They don't think short term like, unfortunately, a lot of North Americans think about the next, what's going to happen in the next month, what's going to happen in the next 2 months. I find people in that part of the world think in long term. For example, if you promise something to an Afghan, you got to come through. You better deliver. Because if you tell a farmer you're going to build a well for him, or you're going to provide something for him, you'd better come through, because they will remember. And they will teach their children to remember. They're very traditional people, and they're very proud people. So first thing we learned, if you're going to make a promise, you got to come through with it, or else they will never talk to you again. You've burned a bridge.
Afghanistan, former Yugoslavia, Cyprus. How do they all compare? I mean, obviously they're all, overseas assignments, and wondering, like, of all the places you served in, what was the most difficult?
Oh, I'd have to say Afghanistan. I think there's really, hands down, each one's different in its own right. In the United Nations tours, it was more of a classic United Nations buffer zone, which of course was through the center of the Greek island of Cyprus. I say with the Greek and the Turk sides, of course. And our mandate was to monitor a buffer zone, where of course if you went to the Balkans, it was a difference. It was more of a kinetic. The lines weren't as clear. They were more, and in Afghanistan, much the same. So different challenges for each. I think Afghanistan posed, I think for the Army in general and for the Canadian forces, posed, I think, a pretty significant challenge. But not to say that the Balkans, of course, were, when we were there with NATO, before that Canada had a UN tour in former Yugoslavia. A number of difficulties with that as well, which we did our best to try to overcome. And
well, I've read a lot of history about Afghanistan, and of course, it's got a long history of warfare, and I think going back to Alexander the Great. But there's been so many different countries and empires and governments and over the years. The British were there for many years. The Russians were there.
Yep.
The Persian Empire. It's been one of the most fought over places on earth, I think, from what I've read.
A gentleman I was talking to in Kandahar, a local resident, mentioned was like a clash of empires, was what his analogy is. Yeah, the great empires of the world. Afghanistan was fought over, and unfortunately, they were in between great empires. And as you say, a lot of world history went down in that part of the world. And they just happen to have a ringside seat for it all. They're cognizant of this, and they know their history. And in fact, I'd argue the average Afghan probably knows more of their history than we do. One of the silver linings of being there was the fact that it was very arid. And anybody that had arthritic knees or any pains, and it was almost like being in Arizona. But it's a very harsh country.
We spoke about the bond between soldiers in the military and the role of the regimental system.
Oh, it's very strong. It's a unit cohesion. We are very fortunate, in my opinion. I know I'm not alone when I say this. We're very fortunate, Canadian Army. We have the regimental system, which we inherited, of course, from the UK. In the regimental system, it's a good bonding thing for soldiers, regardless of their gender or their ethnic background, or you're a Canadian and you're part of this regiment or battalion. And it's so critical to our esprit de corps. It gives us a sense of purpose. It gives soldiers a tradition to cling to. And that's so important, especially this time, in this day and age, where things change so rapidly. That the regimental systems managed to survive is such a big thing. So the camaraderie in the military is like none I've ever seen. In my view anyway, it's essential for us to be able to go on operations, to work together as a team, to be able to carry out whatever the government wants us to do. A lot of people say it's like a closed society. Well, I would argue that it's more of it's a very close bond, both in the reserve and the regular force. Just stepping away from the overseas deployments, domestically, when we go to support floods or ice storms or any natural disaster in Canada, forest fires, whatever, that same esprit de corps and bond transcends into the support to the local population. Where they deploy the troops, they bond together, and they have that sort of close-knit family. We like to call it the regimental or the regimental family.
The way the military unites amongst themselves and with the communities they serve in times of crisis is so admirable. We've seen this at home recently with the military help in long-term care due to COVID-19. We often think of soldier sacrifice in terms of overseas deployments. I wanted to pause here to thank our military members, including reservists, who may not have fought for our country, but have still worked long days, sometimes in awful weather conditions, to serve Canadians at home. Your contribution is vital to our country. Peter shared what Remembrance Day means to him.
It means a lot. It means that we take a day out of our busy lives to remember those that served, those that didn't make it home, those that continue to serve, and those that are gonna serve. It's a little, I say in the tune that really popular song, it's a pittance of time in order to remember the sacrifice of so many proud Canadians over the years. That hasn't changed for me. That's the way I look at it. That's the way my colleagues look at it. And that's the way a lot of Canadians look at it. One of the things that really makes us happy is to see, and we're really grateful about this too, is the outpouring of public support for the military, especially over the last number of years, where we see people thanking us in coffee shops for, thanks for your service. That means a lot to the troops. It really does. So I guess we like to say thanks back to Canadians for, doing that, because they're coming out of their way to help. So what does Remembrance Day mean for me? It's a day to reflect. I felt that way when I was 16. I feel more dedicated to it now after all these years of service. I'm not going to say I know what they went through, but I know I've got a better appreciation of what my grandfathers went through. Well, I'll never really know. I guess I got a stronger opinion of it than I did 42 years ago. They started with a good opinion, very strong opinion about it now. That's Remembrance Day. It's a day to think about the accomplishments and the sacrifice that others made, so we can have right to free speech. Right to be Canadians in a democratic society. It's a big deal.
Seeing what he's seen, I asked Peter if his service made him worry about his son joining the military.
No, none at all. My wife did, but no, actually, she really didn't. I'd be honest with you. No, we were happy for him. Frankly, I didn't make him join. Join if you want. It just wasn't for him at the time after he'd gotten out. Really, no misgivings here. I knew he was going to be well looked after by and large, because the military, despite the odd story you might see, we like to think we treat our people well. But, we're humans. Mistakes are made, obviously. But generally speaking, they're well treated, and we had no reservations about him going in.
Peter discussed how the family members at home also deserve a huge thank you for all that they go through while their loved one is deployed.
My wife, she's a long-suffering military spouse. I feel for her. In fact, she should have got a medal for all the times that I went away. Because the old story behind every service person is a family member or more. And these are the ones that should be getting the medals. Because they put up with all kinds of stress when we go away. And I would never, my only regret is having put my wife through all that hell over those years. She did it because the old story, when she married me, she married the Army. There's a lot of service and sacrifice that comes out of the families too. See, the biggest part of that is that we know what's going on. It's easy for us, but they're sitting back in Petawawa, Gagetown, Edmonton, Simcoe. We had a number of reserve guys from this area that served in Afghanistan. They're sitting back home. They don't have a clue what's going on. And frankly, that's harder than being there because at least we kind of knew, right? So the whole unknown thing is tough on the families. So hats off to the families. They're the real heroes in this whole thing. It's a real eye-opener, and it's an emotional nightmare for families. We went through that firsthand in Petawawa. They went through it in Edmonton, Gagetown, Valcartier, all the bases across the country. And again, here in towns where reservists deployed. Yeah, the families went through a lot of anguish over that because the news was sporadic.
Peter shared his insight into the mental preparation soldiers receive before deployment and how it's grown over his years of service.
Well, we went through a lot of pre-deployment training. It kind of morphed after a number of years. It got different, better, I guess, or I don't know. We can't really tell if it's better or not, but we would go through lectures and, things like that before we deployed. A period of workup training, several weeks or even a couple of months of intensive training. It included things like PTSD, how to deal with stress, all that sort of thing. I think the Army's tried to get better at it. Have we been completely successful? No. Because, there's going to be mistakes. There's going to be misdiagnoses. I think the Army's made a conscious effort to try to get better at it, but it's not easy. It's so individual. It teaches people different ways. An incident can affect people different ways. People talk about this too are law enforcement. Police services guys, firefighters, paramedics, they go through this all the time as well. So how do they cope with it? How do you cope with it? We found talking about it is one thing I know a lot of guys agree with. And again, this is where the regimental family comes in. They talk to their buddies about it. One of the things, and this is not scientific, but something that is during the World Wars, the Canadian Army soldiers would deploy to Europe or Japan, or to Asia, or wherever their theater of operations, in a ship. They'd go on a fairly lengthy cruise over to their deployment area, and they'd get on with their task. At the end of it, they would take a ship home, and they'd sail back to Canada. During the ship ride home, they were together. It was a long ride, and I'm sure they probably got seasick, some of them, but it gave them a chance to bond and to talk about what just happened. You flash forward to modern day. We had soldiers that were literally, if they're injured, were evacuated from theater very quickly. Soldiers on normal repatriation were flown home in a jet. Instead of being home in 6 or 8 weeks, you were home in a matter of sometimes 3-4 days. I know from a personal standpoint that to go from Kandahar to Petawawa, and to be at a Canadian Tire in Pembroke shopping within 72 hours, it just blows you away. So one thing the veterans had, the last generation, they had the ability to bond on a ship. We had the benefit of super fast air travel and technology, which sometimes I think could be a curse, because the soldiers in the most recent conflicts, because of the ability to get them home, have been subjected to home so quick. Maybe that's not such a good thing. Long story short, I think that they're trying to deal with it. I'm not an expert in it. I know a lot of persons that I've dealt with, that I've worked with, that have suffered a great deal from PTSD, and it's the unknown illness, right? The one you can't see, right? Physical injuries are easier to identify. We certainly had our share of those, especially from Afghanistan. But it's the mental, what makes the human mind work? What gets someone, when one guy can see it and it has no effect, and the other guy, it has a tremendous effect and it hurts them. I think the Army's really trying to do it, but it's one of those things, I don't know if we'll ever get 100% at it. I've known tragic incidents where NCOs or officers that I've known very well have taken their own life. You're always going to get somebody that falls through the cracks. The services are there. A lot of times soldiers may or may not choose to use it.
Peter spoke more about our local 6-9 battery.
I don't know all of them because I came back to the regiment after a lengthy absence. I've only been back here now for about 3 years, but I know a number of members of 56 Field, 6-9 Battery, and Simcoe, 56 Field, with the larger community, served in Afghanistan. In fact, this regiment had one of the higher proportions of reservists that volunteered for service with the Canadian Army in Afghanistan. As the battery commander of 6-9 Battery, we're building that place up, and we have the 6-9 Battery Association, a collection of former serving and like-minded citizens of the area that are supportive of the unit, the Cadet Corps, and want to help.
For all of the hard times in the military, There are also good times, and Peter has no regrets.
There's a lot of bad things that happen. I'm kind of a pragmatic guy to begin with. I always looked at military. I remember the fun stuff. Like we had a lot of fun. There was a lot of bad times too, obviously, I'm not going to lie. But I still remember the fun times. Like the night my BSM and I delivered turkey dinner to the guys in Afghanistan at Christmas night. We managed to get turkey dinner up a switchback with all the fixings without spilling it on the switchback. And anybody that served over there knows that there's a lot of bad terrain. But one thing, I would never trade it for the world. I've had a good career. I've had a very happy career. It hasn't been a particularly significant career by any stretch of the imagination, but I wouldn't change it for the world. I've met a lot of really good people, a lot of good Canadians. And the big thing is that, and I don't want to sound corny, but yeah, it's a big deal. I can call people anywhere in Canada, again, NATO allies, American guys and gals, British people I know that you served with, you can call these people up and they remember who you are. It's interesting. And that's kind of neat. And I wouldn't change it for the world. I'd recommend it for any young Canadian that's looking for a challenge. It's definitely something to support. And it's, Canada is a great country. I think a lot of people don't give it enough credit.
We thank you for your service, Captain Davis, and for your continuing work and support for our local 6-9 battery in Simcoe. For more information about joining the local reserves or cadets, call our local office at 519-426-3493, and perhaps you'll find the way that you'd like to serve our country.